Greetings to everyone. Welcome back once again to this educational channel called Learn Bio with Janet. I'm teacher Janet, and today we'll be studying aerobic respiration versus fermentation. We'll make a comparison between these two processes of energy production. Alright, and there'll be a hot question for you to try. So for this video, you're going to find something very useful, and that is the bio keys that I've invented. That is the memory aids such as the acronyms that we have discussed earlier for aerobic respiration and fermentation. You're going to see how it can be applied to easily help you recall all the things you need to know about these two processes, and then to make a comparison between aerobic respiration and fermentation. So this video is a video that all students should watch to learn how to answer the questions on chapter 7, the question on the comparison of aerobic respiration and fermentation more easily in order to score the full marks. First of all, let's discuss an interesting experiment to study fermentation in yeast. This is experiment 7.3 in the textbook. Now, our problem statement is, what are the products of fermentation in yeast? And the hypothesis which answers this problem statement is, fermentation in yeast produces energy, carbon dioxide, and ethanol. Okay, so let's recall our word equation for fermentation in yeast. So we must remember the acronym. Okay, what's the acronym for fermentation in yeast? It's GZ, right? G for glucose, which is broken down into carbon dioxide, and then an ethanol, and energy is released, right? This reaction is catalyzed by the enzyme zymase, Z-Y-M-A-S-E, from yeast, right? So textbook doesn't mention zymase, but this is the enzyme. If you want, you can write it down. All right. So let us look at the variables, right? We are going to prepare two boiling tubes. Boiling tube A contains yeast, but boiling tube B, not shown here, is a control. It will have no yeast. Okay, it does not have any yeast at all. Okay, so that it can act as a control, so we can compare the results with boiling tube A that has yeast suspension later on. So our manipulated variable is the presence or absence of yeast, or just simply put, the presence of yeast. Okay, now the responding variables, they are the changes in temperature and the changes in the lime water and in the whether there's an ethanol smell or not from the boiled glucose solution. Okay, this is to investigate whether there are products that are produced in fermentation in yeast. And then for fixed variable, the fixed variable is the boiled glucose solution, the volume of boiled glucose solution, right? And even the concentration of the boiled glucose solution. Another fixed variable is the anaerobic condition produced, okay, at the beginning of the experiment, so that the yeast can carry out fermentation. Okay, so we're going to see how anaerobic condition is produced. Anaerobic means without oxygen, so it's a condition that has no oxygen in it, like the boiled glucose solution. How do we get rid of the oxygen from it? Okay, so let us look at the procedure first of all. So fill two boiling tubes, A and B also, with 15 ml of 5% glucose solution that has been boiled and left to cool. Okay, so the first step to creating the anaerobic condition where there's no oxygen is to boil the glucose solution to expel or remove all the oxygen from the solution. All right, by boiling the solution. And then after that, you must cool down the glucose solution. If not, if you mix the yeast straight away with the glucose solution, our poor yeast will die, right? Then there will be no results. No results from the experiment. Okay, and then so cool down the glucose solution, and then only mix it with the yeast. Now label the boiling tubes A and B. Okay, then put in the 5 ml of 5% yeast suspension into boiling tube A only. Boiling tube B doesn't have this yeast suspension. Okay, so next we create the anaerobic condition also by putting in some paraffin oil into the boiling tube A and B, and the paraffin oil will float on top, right? So it will prevent oxygen from the atmosphere or from the air here from dissolving in the boiled glucose solution. All right, so in that way it also helps to create the anaerobic condition, right? Here it says paraffin oil prevents oxygen in atmosphere from dissolving in or entering the glucose solution. Okay, so paraffin oil is poured into both boiling tube A and B. Now next, at the top here we get a rubber bung or a cork which has two holes in it, right? One is for the insertion of the thermometer, which we will use to measure the temperature of the boiled glucose solution plus yeast suspension, right? And another hole in the cork is for insertion of the delivery tube, right? So one end of the delivery tube is immersed in the lime water in a test tube. So what's the function of the lime water? Lime water is not air limau for drinking, right? So we may have studied in chemistry, right? Lime water, we use it quite often in our chemistry. So lime water is to help us detect what gas? Carbon dioxide, correct? Okay. If there's carbon dioxide, the lime water will turn what? Turn milky, correct? So we are going to test for the presence of carbon dioxide later on, right? Okay, make sure the end of the delivery tube is inside the lime water, immersed into the lime water. Okay, right, so at the beginning of the experiment you must measure the temperature of the boiled glucose solution and yeast suspension here. All right, so find the initial temperature first and record it down. Next, leave the apparatus for 1 hour. Okay, and then after that measure the final temperature of the boiled glucose solution in both A and B, right? So we will find that the final temperature compared to the initial temperature, is it higher or lower? Or the same? So the final temperature will be higher, okay? So it shows us that the temperature of the solution, boiled glucose solution and yeast suspension has risen. What is the reason for that? It's because the yeast produces what? Energy during fermentation. So some of this energy is used by the yeast for its cellular activities, but some of the energy is released as heat. Okay, some of the energy produced in fermentation is released as heat, which will warm up the boiled glucose solution a little bit. Okay, so this shows us that energy is released in fermentation of yeast. Next, what happens to the lime water after 1 hour? The lime water will turn milky, and we know that this is caused by carbon dioxide produced from the fermentation of yeast suspension here. The carbon dioxide will be released out from the solution, and then it will flow into the delivery tube, and then it will cause the lime water in the boiling tube to turn milky. Okay, then how do we detect the presence of ethanol? Okay, we can use our noses. So you have to open up this, take away this cork, and then just sniff or smell the smell of the mixture here. Okay, so we should be able to smell the smell of alcohol. Okay, because ethanol is produced during fermentation by yeast. Okay, now how about boiling tube B, which is the control? Without the yeast inside, do you think there's any fermentation? There's no fermentation, right? So there'll be no changes observed. Okay, no changes. The temperature of the solution, boiled glucose solution in B will remain the same. At the end of the experiment, it's still the same like the initial temperature, and then the lime water will not turn milky. Neither will there be any alcohol smell in boiling tube. B. Okay? Now for this topic, there's an important question that comes up very often in SPM and even for the new syllabus. I'm sure it's important. Compare and contrast aerobic respiration and fermentation. 10 marks. Okay? So you can ace this essay question and write a very good answer very easily by using my bio keys that I have invented. So let's recall back our acronym for aerobic respiration. Do you remember the acronym that I gave you for aerobic respiration in the very first video for chapter 7 or the second video? It is GOWAC, alright? So remember GOWAC. Glucose plus oxygen produces water, energy and carbon dioxide. So easy to recall. And for fermentation, we have two acronyms. Remember that? The first one is for alcohol fermentation, it is GC, right? And for second one, lactic acid fermentation, it is GEL. Yes, okay? So GC and GEL. Now, once you have written this down, okay, before you start your comparison, you are good to go. Once you have written it down, all right? Because many comparisons will come from these various acronyms or equations, all right? Even writing of the word equation, we will use this. Acronyms to write. So let's look at the similarities. Now, since you're asked to compare and contrast, you must write both similarities and differences. Unless they say differentiate between aerobic respiration and fermentation, or give differences between aerobic respiration and fermentation, then only differences can be written or should be written. All right, compare and contrast means similarities plus differences, and each similarity is 1 mark. Okay, each difference is 1 mark. So make sure you have at least 10 points. 5 similarities here and 5 differences as an example. And you can think of a few more, just add it in. Write it into your essay, okay, to make sure that you really score your 10 marks. Okay, let's see what we can do to score 10 marks. So for the similarities, you can compare the equations here, right? You can see that glucose is the reactant, right, in this reaction. So both processes involve the breakdown of glucose and then its conversion to chemical energy. So the energy that's produced in all these cases are used to form ATP or produce ATP. Okay, so ATP stores energy in its bonds, so it is a form of chemical energy. So number 2, both processes produce chemical energy in the form of ATP, right? So the bonds between the phosphate groups in the ATP, the chemical bonds between the phosphate groups, stores the chemical energy. Now, number 3, both processes begin with glycolysis, in which glucose is broken down into pyruvate. So in here we cannot see the step where glucose is broken down into pyruvate through glycolysis. But this happens in the cytoplasm. If you can recall, in the first few videos we've discussed this. The glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, and glucose is broken down to pyruvate, right? And for both aerobic respiration and fermentation, the process starts off with this glycolysis. Number 4, in both types of energy production, the process begins in the cytoplasm. And that means glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. Both processes occur in yeast, bacteria, animals, and plants. So for most of the organisms here, the preferred choice of respiration is aerobic respiration, if oxygen is present, right? It's only when oxygen is absent, then the organisms will turn to carry out fermentation. Will carry out fermentation due to lack of oxygen. Okay, right. So these are the 5 similarities. Each one is 1 mark each. Okay, so you can write this down, and then let's go on to the differences. Going on to the differences. So again, first of all, we write down our acronyms. Okay, GOWAC, and for fermentation, GC and GEL. Right. So now the aspects. I've written down the aspects here at the side here, so it's easier to remember. Now, use of oxygen. For aerobic respiration, As you can see from the equation here, oxygen is required. The O stands for oxygen. Now for fermentation, from the equation we can see that oxygen is not required at all, right? Then breakdown of glucose, it is complete for aerobic respiration. The glucose is broken down into W, water, C, carbon dioxide. Whereas for fermentation, it is incomplete or partial because the glucose is broken down into substances like E for ethanol here, L for lactic acid. So these substances are still consist of molecules that are still bigger than that of water and carbon dioxide. So a lot of energy is still stored in the bonds in these molecules. Breakdown of glucose. Okay, we've done that. Now we'll go on to the end products of the process. So going back to the equation, you can see that water and carbon dioxide, W and C, and of course energy, E for energy, are produced. And lactic acid and ethanol is not produced at all. Whereas for fermentation, we can see from the equation here, W is not there, so water is not produced. And for yeast and plant cells, which carry out this process, GC, now the C here stands for carbon dioxide, E for ethanol, and the other E is for energy. So ethanol, carbon dioxide, and energy are produced. Then for muscle cells and bacteria, E is for energy, L for lactic acid. So lactic acid and energy are produced, right? So simple. The recall will be very fast. Now the number of ATP molecules produced per glucose molecule is 38 ATP molecules for aerobic respiration and only 2 for fermentation. All right. And the energy produced per mole of glucose is large for large amount for aerobic respiration. If you can recall, you can write it in 2,898 kilojoules of energy per mole of glucose. If you can't recall, just write down large amount, right? And the other one, small amount of energy produced, 210 kJ in yeast during alcoholic fermentation, and 150 kilojoules, kJ is kilojoules, in muscle cells and bacteria in lactic acid fermentation. All right. If you can't recall these values, it's okay. Just write down large and small amount of energy. At least remember the number of ATP molecules, because usually the molecules and the amount of energy is grouped as the same thing. It's the energy produced per energy produced from the glucose molecule. Either write as 38 ATP molecules, okay, per glucose molecule, or 2,898 kilojoules of energy per mole of glucose, as an example for aerobic respiration. So far we have looked at 5 similarities and 5 differences. Here are 2 more differences. Where does aerobic respiration occur in the cell? So there are 2 stages. For the first stage, aerobic respiration occurs in the cytoplasm. And for the second stage, aerobic respiration occurs in the mitochondria. Whereas for fermentation, fermentation occurs only in the cytoplasm. And the molecules never go into the mitochondria at all. Okay? Glycolysis occurs first of all in fermentation, and after that, the pyruvate is converted into other molecules, all in the cytoplasm. Now, the equation. Again, here we can recall our acronym for aerobic respiration, which is GOAC. And for fermentation, it is GC and GEL. So, the word equation will be glucose plus oxygen produces carbon dioxide, water, and energy. You can state the amount of energy here. And this is according to the acronym GOAC, right? G, glucose, O, oxygen, W, water, E, energy, C, carbon dioxide. So it's very easy to recall and write down the word equation. Now for yeast and plants, GC. So glucose produces ethanol, carbon dioxide, and energy, 210 kilojoules. Then for bacteria, in bacteria and muscle cells, remember GEL. Glucose produces lactic acid and energy, right? Always write the energy last, and then you can put in brackets the amount of energy. So here, these equations in blue are called the word equations, which you can write in for differences. Do we need to write the chemical equation? Normally, if you have written the word equation, is enough, right? But you can also write in the chemical equation if you want to, or you can also recall it for other types of questions, all right? Like objective questions, you may need to know it, right? Okay, so this molecule is glucose plus oxygen produces carbon dioxide and water. Now for fermentation, this is glucose, and this molecule C2H5OH is ethanol, CO2 is carbon dioxide. Then for fermentation in bacteria and muscle cells, alcohol, lactic acid fermentation, not alcohol fermentation. For lactic acid fermentation, we have glucose broken down into 2 molecules of lactic acid, C3H6O3, which is half a molecule of glucose. Finally, to remember all the different aspects that you want to compare, here is another memory aid. It's up to you whether you want to memorize this, because most important is to memorize the equations for aerobic respiration and for fermentation. Okay, but this is an extra one, and I also teach this to my students, and it helps them to remember the different aspects they need to compare, especially for essay questions. Okay, so remember PLEGO. Think of the word Lego, Lego set. So PLEGO. P for product. What are the products of aerobic respiration and fermentation? Okay, which you can find from your word equation. L for location. Where do these processes occur? As we have seen here under number 6, right? The location in the cell. E is for energy. How much energy is released? How many ATPs, right? For aerobic respiration and fermentation. How many ATPs are produced? Or how much energy is released in kilojoules? And then E for equation, so the word equation is here, you can write. So it will remind us to write in the word equation. G is for glucose, whether glucose is broken down partially or completely. And then O for oxygen. Is oxygen required by the cell during the process of aerobic respiration and fermentation? Okay, so this is the memory aid that you can use to recall all the different aspects. Now, in the previous question, we were asked directly to compare and contrast aerobic respiration and fermentation. But normally in the exam, they may give you pictures, all right? For biology exam, there are many pictures, so we have to get used to analyzing diagrams. And they may give you 2 pictures for you to identify the process that's occurring, and then after that, ask you to compare and contrast the 2 processes, okay? So let's read the question first. Compare and contrast the 2 types of energy production shown here and the breakdown of glucose in muscle cells of A, girl A, and this man B. All right. So this is a type of HOTS question where you are given a new situation or situations for you to analyze, right? So firstly, we have to look at the diagram. We see a girl sitting down, resting in a resting position. She's not exercising vigorously or moving around vigorously. So obviously, she's just carrying out aerobic respiration in her cells. All right, there's no lack of oxygen for the aerobic respiration in her cells. But for this man B, he's running on the treadmill, he's sweating, and here's the clue: he's suffering from muscle fatigue, right? So muscle fatigue is caused by lactic acid fermentation in muscle cells due to the lack of oxygen supplied for energy production. Okay, so we can say that A carries out aerobic respiration in her cells and B is carrying out lactic acid fermentation in muscle cells that causes the muscle fatigue. Of course, B is also carrying out aerobic respiration too. Okay, but we are asked to compare and contrast, so we have to think of 2 different processes of energy production. Okay, so for B, it's lactic acid fermentation. Can it be alcohol fermentation? No, because alcohol fermentation occurs in yeast and paddy plants, unless they show the yeast cell here instead. All right, so since it's the human muscle cells, it is lactic acid fermentation that's occurring to cause the muscle fatigue. Okay, so these 2 lines here may be 1 or 2 marks. Then you have another 8 or 9 marks to go, where you can write down, say, 5 similarities or 5 differences. All right, so always make sure that you write more, if you can, a few more points, in case some points, for some points there may be a bit of mistake. Right, similarities between the two types of energy production by A and B. So these similarities have been discussed just now. Both processes involve breakdown of glucose and its conversion to chemical energy. Both processes produce chemical energy in the form of ATP. Both processes begin glycolysis, in which glucose is converted to pyruvate. In both types of energy production, the process begins in the cytoplasm, and both processes occur in human muscle cells. 1 mark each for each similarity, and also 1 mark each for each difference. Okay, so notice that I didn't put in both types of respiration for number 4, okay, because as we said, lactic acid fermentation is considered different from respiration. All right, in this syllabus, it's an alternative pathway. Now, going on to the differences in answering our essay question. So here we can draw a table and write down A and B in the titles, because in the question we were asked to compare the energy production for A, the girl, and B, the man, right? So don't straight away write aerobic respiration, because we are comparing A and B. You can put aerobic respiration for A in brackets, and for B, lactic acid fermentation in brackets. Okay? Next, we just write down our BioKey acronym, right, before we start, so that the comparison is very clear, right? So remember that for B is lactic acid fermentation and not alcohol fermentation, because that's for yeast. Alcohol fermentation is for yeast. Okay, so let's go through the various aspects as we have discussed in the earlier slides, right? It's the same thing, except that for B, we don't write any alcohol fermentation, any processes of alcohol fermentation, just lactic acid fermentation. So that is to answer the question directly, all right? So use of oxygen. Oxygen is required for A, but for B it is not. Breakdown of glucose, it is complete for A, but incomplete for B. End products of the process, so refer to your equation, go back. Water, carbon dioxide, and energy are produced. Lactic acid is not produced. Whereas for B, water is not produced. Lactic acid and energy are produced. Number of ATP molecules produced per glucose molecule, 38 ATP molecules for A and 2 ATP molecules for B. Energy produced per mole of glucose, a large amount of energy is produced. For A, 2,898 kilojoules per mole of glucose. But for B, only a small amount is produced, that is 150 kilojoules per mole of glucose. So we don't write 210 kilojoules because that is for yeast. The amount of energy produced in alcohol fermentation in yeast is 210. Okay, this one is 150 for lactic acid fermentation. Right, so take notice that all these explanations are in full. So even this one, 38 ATP molecules, we have to write is produced. So make the sentences complete. Oxygen is required. Don't just write use of oxygen, and this one, no oxygen. Okay, so an important point or tip from the examiner is make sure your sentences are complete for whatever answer you write for essay questions or structured questions. If they're incomplete, then they may not make sense, and you may not get marks for it. Okay, so make sure that your sentences are complete. Lastly, here are two more differences between A and B. Location in the cell. The process of energy production occurs in the cytoplasm for the first stage and in the mitochondria for the second stage. Okay, for girl A. And for the man B, the process of energy production occurs only in the cytoplasm. Equation. So think of COAC for aerobic respiration in A. Glucose plus oxygen produces carbon dioxide and water and energy, with the release of 2,898 kilojoules of energy. And then for B, think of gel. Glucose produces lactic acid plus energy, and energy is 150 kilojoules per mole of glucose. Right. So for the equations, especially for the acronyms, please don't write the acronym into the answer script, all right? You can write it on a separate piece of paper to refer to it, okay? Don't write on top of the table and then, write on the answer script and leave it there. If you write it down, you make sure you write in pencil and rub it off later, okay? So, of course, we don't want the examiner to see all that and then think, and they may not know what it is in the first place, all right? So it'll be like some untidy thing to them. So write it on a separate piece of paper, the equations on the question paper will be okay, all right? And you can refer to it as you are writing your comparing the processes of energy production. Okay, that's all for this video. I hope that you found it very helpful, and do remember the 3 acronyms: GOAC, GZ, and GEL. You can also apply it in objective questions, all right? So for me, from time to time, I will train my students to remember these acronyms. So through constant repetition, they are very quick to give me the answer, all right? They give me the acronym, but they know what it stands for, all right? So practice using it, and that's all for this video. So do like, share, and subscribe to my channel, and I'll be producing more videos like this in future if the response is very good, okay? So in this season, do take care of health, and also do continue to keep your spirits up, keep your attitude positive and strong. Okay, until we meet again, goodbye.